I have been eagerly awaiting Snow White's release for a long time now. Not just because it promised to bring with it plenty of opportunity to give the movie the bashing it deserves, but also because I've grown sick and tired of hearing about this movie and this actress I'd never heard of before every week for the last 3 years. So thank fuck, after all the controversy, all the headlines, and all the highly expected disappointment, we can finally all leave Snow White in the trash bin it made for itself. And in the end, what did Disney accomplish with Snow White? A box office disaster, a highly publicized further squandering of goodwill, and another live-action adaptation that manages to feel entirely bereft of soul or charm. And on top of all of that, Snow White was Disney's golden goose in a lot of ways. Beyond Mickey Mouse, Snow White's IP is viewed as one of the most sacred and iconic in Disney's portfolio. Snow White, it could be said, was the beating heart of their fairy tale series. The character and her story have long sat atop their line of Disney princesses that have been money-printing machines for generations. But thanks to Disney's short-sighted plan to push out this boring, low-effort rendition, and one actress's inability to keep her gigantic mouth shut, this high-budget adaptation released as a resounding flop, and a complete vindication of all those who have criticized it for years now. And I'll talk more in detail about Snow White's abject failure after I get in a quick recap of the movie's story. So for the 1.5 people who care about it, here's your spoiler warning. Obviously, this is a familiar story overall, but I think it will still be enlightening to see how this movie may differ from your memory of the animated original. And it starts with a change right off the bat, for you see Snow White, in this retelling, can't be named for having skin white as snow, for reasons that are immediately obvious. Instead, she's named Snow White after the winter storm she was born during. Now, with Snow White in her adolescence, her mother dies, and her dad marries the first harlot who walks through the door afterward. Known only as the Evil Queen, Snow White's new stepmother's vanity has her obsessed with being the fairest of all, something she regularly confirms with her magic mirror on the wall. After Snow White's dad leaves to get milk, he never returns, and Snow White is forced into servitude by her stepmother, and the neglected kingdom falls into disrepair due to the queen's self-obsessed vanity. One day, Snow White happens upon a thief who inspires her to plead with the queen to share their pies with the kingdom so everyone can eat pie and be happy. I think the destitute, starving people need more nutrition than pies can offer, but Snow White says let them eat pie. The thief is captured, but Snow White frees him and gives him a chunk of a Panera baguette, and this is so brave, and now, much to the ire of the queen, this means Snow White is fairer and hotter than the evil queen, according to the magic mirror. And, of course, this is a fairy tale, but there should be some things rooted in reality, and the idea that Gal Gadot has to worry about being fairer than this gremlin is pretty immersion-breaking. Naturally, the queen sends her huntsman to kill Snow White, but he spares her, and she flees into the enchanted forest, where she finds a cottage and meets the creepiest, most out-of-place looking CGI dwarves you could have imagined. Happy, grumpy, sleepy, sneezy, bashful, Doc, and Dopey. Who's not actually Dopey, because dopey people are a protected class or something. He's actually just a victim of bullying. She proceeds to teach them a communist coping technique for dealing with menial labor called Whistle While You Work, and Doc informs her that the queen's capitalistic greed is ruining the land. Snow White goes out in search of a group of bandits in the woods, and it just so happens to be the thief from earlier. What are the odds that it's the only other person she's spoken to in her adult life beside the queen? She and the inclusive bandits get ambushed by the queen's guards, but the bandits help Snow White escape as they kick and punch their way through the heavily armed and armored military retinue. But the thief gets wounded in the escape, and Doc the dwarf is able to save him, before the thief and Snow White have one of those stupid moments where someone else is like, "Hey, it looks like you two like each other," and they're like, "Oh, no, of course not." And 35 seconds later, she's singing about how madly in love she is. And they almost kiss, and it's kinda gross because he looks like a solid 29 and she looks 12. But the thief gets captured and taken to the queen. Then the queen turns into an old crone and shows up to Snow White's door armed with a poisoned apple. Despite this random old lady walking up to the cottage looking like Emperor Palpatine, Snow White accepts the apple. And despite being literally 4 steps outside of a cottage full of food, Snow White just has to bite into it immediately. Unsurprisingly, the fentanyl kicks in right away, and she dies, leaving the queen to be the hottest yet again. The thief is locked away in the dungeon with the huntsman who betrayed the queen, and despite the two of them being there together for days presumably, They just now get the idea to work together to escape, and this easily works and they walk out the back door without a guard in sight. The bandit shows up to Snow White's funeral and plants a wet one right on her lips, and Snow White wakes up to badger him about the importance of consent. Just kidding, but I fully expected that. Also, I distinctly remember this actress saying this version of Snow White wasn't going to be lying around waiting for the prince to save her.
So that was a fucking lie.
Dressed up like Red Riding Hood, Snow White returns to the kingdom and confronts the queen, who orders her death. But Snow White makes a courageous, risky move of talking to the 4 guards around her, and they all turn on the queen. The evil queen whips around to see the 7 dwarves in her castle, which means she loses automatically, I guess. The queen frantically retreats to the magic mirror, which informs her that Snow White's superior beauty comes from within. An explanation I think we all needed to make this disparity make sense. The mirror shatters, and the evil queen is turned into stone and gets sucked into the void left behind by the mirror. Everything culminates in what looks like a wedding, but isn't explicitly a wedding because the princess don't need no man, and the movie comes to an end. And there you have it. After 3 or 4 years of the incessant noise about this movie, Snow White is finally in the book. And it's a book you can immediately turn around and toss into the dumpster fire this movie created. I'm not surprised by how boring this movie was. I mean, I didn't expect gripping set pieces or any serious level of intrigue from a live-action fairy tale. But what I did find surprising was Snow White's complete lack of charm. You'd think that any kind of fairy tale would at least have to have some charming aspects to it. But this soulless reimagining of Snow White never reached any level of charm in any sort of way. And sure, you need to keep the story suited for young children, but I think even they would be let down by that climax, a term I have to use so you know what I'm referring to, even though Snow White had one of the most laughably anticlimactic climaxes I've ever seen. I mean, I feel like defeating an evil queen should take more than guilt-tripping 4 guards and 7 dwarves standing in the castle like it's captured the flag. Now, it's been a while since I saw the animated original, but I certainly don't remember viscerally hating the dwarves like this movie made me do. They looked just awful. It was like CGI characters were plucked out of Polar Express and thrown into a mostly otherwise live-action film. Most of all of the new songs were horrible, the costumes were bad, Gal Gadot can't sing, and it looks like she forgot how to act as well. The 2 classic songs, Hi Ho and Whistle While You Work, were really the only saving graces in the entirety of this movie. This movie changed the origins of Snow White's name, it made the prince not a prince, it made the dwarves magical, it left out problematic songs like Someday My Prince Will Come, it redefined what fairest means, and it added an entirely new 3rd act and ending to give Snow White an arc suitable for modern times. In short, it fucked everything up. And now we come to the firebrand at the center of it all, Rachel Zegler. The girl can sing, I'll give her that. But that's just about the only thing I've seen from her that wasn't completely detestable. For years now, she's been unable to keep her mouth shut about politics, a war, and how classic fairy tales need to be updated to suit the sensibilities of her and her ilk. She single-handedly ensured this movie's failure, but surely now she'll do the adult thing and bear full responsibility for this all-time flop, right? In any case, now that Snow White's story has been rewritten in her image, she can fade back into the obscurity she deserves and try shutting the fuck up for a change. As for the numbers behind this flop, Snow White brought in $43 million domestically in its opening weekend and $87 million globally, about $15 million short of projections. And that figure gives it the 2nd worst Disney live-action adaptation ahead of only Mufasa. Stack that up against a $270 million budget and another $100 for marketing, and Snow White is a bona fide bomb. On Rotten Tomatoes, Snow White is getting 74% from viewers, but on Metacritic it's getting the reception it deserves, pulling in a 1.2 from fans. Any way you cut it, Snow White more than earns the Hatewatch label. For those who might think, this movie's not for you, is a thoughtful rebuke of criticism they don't like, this movie's not for anyone. It's boring, charmless, devoid of any real quality, and it abandons its only message that sharing is good about a quarter of the way in. This was low-effort dog shit all around. Many believe that Snow White was Disney's golden goose, and now after this box office bomb, we can officially say that this golden goose is cooked. Good riddance. Have you been long awaiting this flop in the making? Do you feel a sense of vindication in watching Snow White crash and burn? Does Disney have any fairy tales left on their roster for them to cock up? Let us know in the comments below. Also remember to like the video if you liked it, and subscribe to HateWatchers for reviews of other shows and movies. Thank you for taking the Prince and the charm out of Prince Charming with us today, and we'll catch you on the next one.